What CNN confirmed in the past 24 hours is not a military update. It is not a routine planning document making its way through the normal bureaucratic channels of the Pentagon's wargaming process. It is the operational admission of a strategic failure whose full dimensions the American public has not been told, delivered through sources familiar with classified planning sessions that the institutions responsible for managing this conflict have every incentive to keep out of public view for as long as possible. The United States military is secretly developing new plans to bomb Iran's defenses inside the Strait of Hormuz. Not the Iran that exists in the public narrative of a defeated adversary whose military has been comprehensively degraded by 55 days of the most intensive American air campaign since the Iraq War. The Iran that exists in the classified intelligence assessments being generated right now inside the Pentagon and the National Security Council, the Iran whose coastal missile systems are largely intact, whose thousands of one-way attack drones survived the bombing campaign and have been moved to new strategic positions during the ceasefire, and whose ability to threaten every vessel attempting to transit the 34-kilometer waterway that carries 20% of the world's oil has not been eliminated by anything the United States has done in the 55 days since this war began. The war the American public was told about and the war the Pentagon is now secretly planning for are not the same war. The first war was a 12-day bombing campaign that destroyed two-thirds of Iran's acknowledged military production capacity and was presented to the American public as a decisive degradation of Iranian military power. The second war, the one whose plans CNN sources confirmed are being developed right now in classified planning cells, is a concentrated bombing campaign around the Strait of Hormuz itself, targeting the coastal missile systems, the small boat fleets, the mine-laying infrastructure, and the military installations along Iran's southern coastline that the First War deliberately chose not to prioritize. The reason the First War chose not to prioritize those targets is the reason the Second War is now being planned. And that reason is the most consequential single admission in the 55-day history of this conflict. The Trump administration underestimated Iran's willingness to close the Strait of Hormuz. Two sources familiar with the initial planning for the war told CNN directly that the closure could likely have been prevented if the United States had positioned military assets near the strait at the very outset of the conflict to deter Iran from doing so. It did not. Iran closed the strait within hours of the first American bombs falling on February 28th, and the United States military has been dealing with the consequences of that failure every single day since. To understand why the Pentagon is now secretly developing plans for a second, concentrated military campaign inside the Strait of Hormuz, you need to understand the precise nature of the strategic miscalculation that made those plans necessary. The initial American war plan for the conflict with Iran was designed around a specific set of operational priorities, and those priorities did not include the Strait of Hormuz as a primary target set in the opening phase of the campaign. The logic driving that decision reflected a genuine analytical judgment that is now being assessed by the same planning establishment that made it as having been wrong. The judgment was that Iran would not close the strait, that the economic consequences of closing the world's most critical energy choke point would be too severe for Iran's own interests, too damaging to the Chinese energy imports that sustain the economic relationship Beijing has built with Tehran, and too likely to generate the kind of international pressure that would isolate Iran diplomatically at the moment it most needed international support. That judgment informed a war plan that prioritized targets deep inside Iranian territory, command and control infrastructure, missile production facilities, nuclear sites, and leadership targets over the coastal defense systems and naval assets that would be required to enforce a strait closure. The targets deep inside Iran were struck with extraordinary precision and devastating effect. Two-thirds of Iran's acknowledged military production capacity was destroyed in 12 days of American airstrikes. The nuclear facilities at Natanz were struck. Senior Iranian leadership was eliminated. The damage to Iran's strategic military infrastructure was real, documented, and severe by any historical standard of aerial bombardment. And within hours of the first strike, Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz anyway. The economic consequences that the planning establishment assessed as too severe for Iran to accept turned out to be consequences Iran had already calculated, already prepared for, and already decided were an acceptable price for the strategic leverage that strait closure provided. Iran's oil exports, which flow through the strait, had already been partially rerouted through alternative channels. Iran's calculation was not that strait closure would be painless. It was that the pain of strait closure fell more heavily on the global economy, on the Gulf states, and on the American political system managing inflation and energy prices than it fell on Iran. That calculation has proven correct for 55 consecutive days. The coastal missile systems, the small boat fleets, and the mine-laying infrastructure that Iran is using to enforce that closure were not destroyed in the first 12 days of bombing because they were not the primary target set. They are largely intact. They have been reinforced during the ceasefire, and they are now the target set that the Pentagon's secret new planning is designed to address in a second campaign that the first campaign's miscalculation made inevitable. The single most consequential intelligence assessment of this entire conflict is one that is not being presented to the American public in a form that communicates its full strategic weight. Roughly half of Iran's missile launchers survived the complete American bombing campaign. Half. The United States conducted the most intensive aerial bombardment of any nation since the Second World War across the first 12 days of this conflict, deploying 3 carrier strike groups, hundreds of precision-guided munitions, and the full spectrum of American offensive air power against Iran's military infrastructure. And when the bombing paused and the ceasefire began on April 7th, roughly half of the missile launchers that Iran possessed on February 27th were still operational. That number requires honest examination, because the institutional instinct of the planning establishment that produced it is to present it in a frame that minimizes its implications. Half of Iran's missiles surviving is presented as evidence that the campaign was partially successful, that meaningful degradation was achieved, and that the remaining capability can be addressed in a subsequent phase of military operations. What it actually represents is the operational foundation of everything Iran has done since the ceasefire began. The missile launchers that survived are not sitting idle in their pre-war positions, waiting to be targeted in a second American campaign. CNN confirmed that Iran moved them to new strategic positions during the ceasefire. The satellite imagery that American intelligence uses to track those launchers is now working against a targeting picture that is being deliberately scrambled by an adversary that understood from the moment the ceasefire was announced that the pause in bombing would be used by American intelligence to identify surviving assets and develop updated targeting solutions. Iran used the same window to move those assets. The thousands of one-way attack drones that also survived the bombing campaign have been similarly repositioned. The IRGC's small boat fleet, assessed by American intelligence as numbering in the hundreds, if not thousands of individual vessels, has dispersed across the coastal geography of Iran's southern shoreline in ways that make the concentrated targeting required to eliminate it operationally challenging, even for the combined air power of 3 carrier strike groups. What the Pentagon's secret new planning is confronting is not the Iran that existed on February 27th, whose military positions were mapped, whose assets were geolocated, and whose targeting picture had been built over years of intelligence preparation. It is an Iran that used 55 days of conflict, including 14 days of ceasefire, to move, hide, disperse, and reinforce exactly the assets that the second campaign is now being designed to target. The Iran that the new bombing plan will encounter when and if the ceasefire collapses is an adversary that has had 55 days to study American targeting methodology, identify the gaps in American surveillance coverage along the southern coastline, and position its surviving capability in exactly the locations that those gaps provide. The secret planning for a second military campaign inside the Strait of Hormuz is not being developed inside a Pentagon operating with the institutional coherence and strategic clarity that a decision of this magnitude requires. It is being developed inside a defense establishment that has fired 34 senior officials since the Trump administration began, whose Navy secretary was removed effective immediately this week as the Iran war intensified, and whose civilian leadership is managing a conflict whose trajectory was shaped by a foundational miscalculation, while simultaneously dealing with the institutional disruption that the removal of 34 senior officials across every level of the defense bureaucracy produces. The firing of Navy Secretary John Phelan is not a personnel matter in the conventional sense. That word applies to cabinet-level departures. It is the removal of the senior civilian official responsible for the naval force that is simultaneously enforcing the blockade of Iranian ports, protecting commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz, and developing the operational plans for a potential second military campaign around the waterway. The acting head of the Navy is now Hung Cao, a 25-year Navy combat veteran who was confirmed as undersecretary. He is inheriting a naval operation of extraordinary complexity and strategic consequence, without the institutional continuity that a confirmed secretary would provide. The blockade that the Navy is enforcing is massive by any operational standard. 10,000 American soldiers, 17 warships, and more than 100 aircraft are committed to turning back vessels attempting to transit to or from Iranian ports. 33 ships have been redirected since the blockade began on April 13th. The operational tempo of that enforcement mission, combined with the mine-clearing operations underway in the Strait shipping channels, combined with the force protection requirements of operating warships in waters where Iran has demonstrated the will and the capability to attack commercial vessels during an active ceasefire, is consuming the operational capacity of the naval force that would also be required to execute the second bombing campaign if the ceasefire collapses. The United States Senate has now voted 5 times to restrict Trump's war powers over Iran. Every vote has failed. The most recent vote was 55 to 46, defeating a measure led by Senator Tammy Baldwin to curb presidential authority to continue the war. The margin is not expanding in the administration's favor. The political coalition sustaining the war authorization is holding, but it is holding against a growing opposition that the compounding economic consequences of the strait closure are strengthening with every week that the waterway remains effectively closed, and only 16 ships per day dare attempt a transit that normally carries 50 to 60 vessels. The development of secret plans for a second military campaign inside the Strait of Hormuz is the operational expression of a strategic reality that the public framing of this conflict as a managed ceasefire moving toward a negotiated resolution does not accommodate. It means that the military establishment responsible for advising the president on options for ending this conflict has concluded in the classified planning sessions whose existence CNN sources confirmed that the ceasefire as currently structured cannot produce the outcome that ending this conflict requires. It cannot reopen the Strait of Hormuz. The coastal missile systems that Iran is using to deter commercial shipping from transiting the waterway are largely intact. The small boat fleet that the IRGC is deploying to attack vessels that attempt transit is operational. The mines that are blocking the navigable shipping channels will take months to clear, even under the most optimistic operational assumptions about Iranian restraint during the clearance process. And Iranian restraint during the clearance process is not an assumption that the seizure of commercial vessels and attacks on container ship bridges during an active ceasefire justifies making. Military strikes around the strait, CNN sources confirmed explicitly, are unlikely on their own to immediately reopen the waterway. Iran's coastal geography provides too many dispersal options for the small boat fleet. The mine threat persists regardless of what happens to the assets that deployed the mines. And striking coastal military installations along Iran's southern shoreline is an escalation beyond the target sets of the first campaign, whose consequences for the ceasefire, for the negotiating process, and for the regional escalation dynamics that 14 days of diplomatic pause have only partially stabilized, are consequences that every planning session generating these options is simultaneously required to account for. The secret plan is not a solution. It is a contingency for the moment that the absence of a solution becomes operationally undeniable. That moment arrives when the ceasefire collapses, when the diplomatic track in Islamabad produces its 5th consecutive failure to close the gap between American demands for complete uranium enrichment suspension and Iranian refusal to negotiate under the shadow of a naval blockade, and when the economic cost of a closed strait, compounding at $20 billion per day, reaches the threshold that the American political system cannot absorb without a visible military response. Iran knows this threshold exists. Iran's parliament speaker said this week that Iran has prepared new cards on the battlefield. Half of Iran's missiles are repositioned and waiting. Thousands of drones that survived the bombing are in new locations that the targeting picture from February no longer accurately reflects. And the Pentagon is secretly drawing up plans to find them. The question that the classified planning sessions generating those plans are not able to answer is the same question that has driven every escalatory decision in this conflict since February 28th. Whether destroying what remains of Iran's military capability around the strait will reopen the waterway faster than Iran can make Washington pay the price for trying. 55 days into this conflict, with the strait carrying 16 ships where it once carried 60, with the global economy bleeding $20 billion every single day, and with the Navy Secretary fired and the planning for a second campaign underway in rooms that CNN sources have now confirmed exist, that question does not yet have an answer that either side has been willing to state publicly. The missiles are repositioned, the plans are being drawn, and the ceasefire is holding by a margin that 55 days of evidence suggests neither side fully controls. The secret is out. The Pentagon knows the first war did not finish the job. Half of Iran's missiles survived, repositioned, and are waiting. The strait is carrying 16 ships where it once carried 60. The Navy Secretary is gone. And somewhere in a classified planning cell, the maps for a second campaign are being drawn against a target picture that Iran spent 14 days of ceasefire deliberately scrambling. The question is not whether that second campaign is coming. The question is whether the diplomatic track collapses before or after Iran plays the new cards its parliament speaker promised. The next move belongs to Tehran. The plans are ready in Washington, and the world is watching 16 ships cross a waterway that used to carry the energy that kept it running. Stay sharp. We will see you in the next one.